Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, to continue with our Dhammachakka Sutta theme for the rains retreat, our unsystematic, unscholarly, sort of rambling, but reflection this week. This week's theme, I thought, would be obviously the Dhammachakka is where the Buddha introduced the Four Noble Truths you're familiar with. It is the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the way, the end of suffering, and the way and the training, the path that leads to the end of suffering. That's Four Noble Truths. Right? But sometimes you see the Dhammachakka wheel. It's mostly, they don't have the 8 spoke, which is the Eightfold Path. Most Dhammachakka has 12 spoke. So you're thinking, where does that come from? So tonight, you'll find out. It's the, remember what I said last week, when the Buddha became enlightened, right? His quest was to end suffering, to find a way out of the wheel of samsara, the wheel becoming, back and forth. His quest was to find the way out of the cycle of, birth, old age, sickness, and death. He wanted to set himself to be a great spiritual leader. He didn't set out to find a religion. He didn't set out to start a movement. The way the spiritual, seekers was already there in India. He was just following along that path to discover the truth. And then when he discovered the truth, he taught that over the years. And then there's a movement started around him. So it wasn't his quest to start anything in the beginning. And remember, what the Buddha left behind for each and every one of us is the training. That's what the Buddha taught. That's Buddhism about. It's not really a religion. Some people say it's a religion, just a way of thinking, a way of life. It's a psychology. At the heart of Buddhism, it's a training. He left a blueprint to train the mind in a way that brings about the condition of the end of suffering. Yeah. So it's all about causes and condition. And obviously in the sutta, he introduced the Four Noble Truths, which is saying. But with that, there is something to be done about the Four Noble Truths. It's not just reading, understanding about it, and then you become enlightened once you understood all that. No, it is the path. Like I said, it's a training he left behind, something you have to work your way through. And understanding is a major part of it. So he introduced the noble truth of suffering, dukkha, right? So he says birth is suffering, is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Grief, lamentation, pain, sorrow, and despair are dukkha. Association with the dislight is dukkha. Separation from the light is dukkha. Not to get what one wants is dukkha. So all that is suffering in different ways. It could be the subtle suffering of, just not quite, things aren't quite right. Things are pretty good, but not quite right. The subtle stress of not getting exactly what you want. To being the coarse suffering of, divorce, end of relationship, of war, famine, destruction, to that kind. So all that. So similarly, to suffering, sometimes some people introduce the word of like stress, because suffering just means it can be really terrible, but it could be the subtle stuff as well. And it's the dukkha covers everything, from just a slight dissatisfaction with the way life is, to downright being tortured, things are really, really terrible, you're depressed and confused and had enough. So it covers a range of human experience, not just a coarse one. So that's the noble truth of the cause of suffering. And he explains why the suffering comes about. The cause of suffering is craving, which craving has 3 types of craving. The craving that causes rebirth is bounded with pleasure and lust. This is the common one. Ever seeking fresh delight, now here, now there. And I thought that's a very good explanation. That's what craving, sensual desires. You're always looking around, not quite enough. It's looking around, now here, now there, going here, going there. Go to this restaurant, get that food, the other food. Going on holiday, buying new things. So it's just looking around, this thirst and this search for something new to entertain ourselves. So that's craving for sense pleasure. But there's also the craving for existence and craving for annihilation. It's funny he goes on to more of the sensual pleasure, because I think that is more common and it's the biggest chunk of craving. The other ones are more subtle. Craving for existence. So it's craving, as you'll see explained, as craving to be something, to be somebody. Craving to be a personality. So that's craving for existence. May I be somebody in the future? May I be enlightened even? That's a craving, a subtle kind of craving. May I be famous? May I be well-liked? It's a craving for existence. And then when you don't get any of that, you're craving for annihilation. So that's the craving that you'll see people indulge in from time to time. When they don't like life, and then, obviously suicide is a big expression of that craving for annihilation. But sometimes a subtle level of sleeping a lot. You're not having a good day, body's kind of aching, mind's kind of grumpy, so you just stay in bed and sleep. Yeah, so that's a type of craving for annihilation. Another one is alcohol, drugs, just wipe yourself out. Opioid addiction is a major part of that. You don't want to be there for whatever reason, maybe mental suffering, distress. So you wipe yourself out through these kind of other type, through drugs. So those are the 3 cravings that leads to suffering. But then he introduces the third one, the cessation of dukkha. And this is the 4 ways of how he ceases. The complete cessation, by his giving up. You give up that craving, you abandon that craving, you release that craving, or you completely detach from it. I think detach is that word, complete detachment is what's that word in Pali? It's like more non-roosting. Craving, the ideas, the feelings of wanting comes up, but you don't attach to it. You don't graft onto it. It goes into the mind, but then it fades away. You let that go. So you don't allow these kind of ideas to roost in the mind. And then, of course, there is the 4th Noble Truth. That is the way leading to cessation of dukkha. And this is where the Eightfold Path gets introduced. The Eightfold Path of right view, right intention, right life, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. That's the Eightfold Path that introduces at the end. But remember the 4 Noble Truths. But the 4 Noble Truths, just doesn't stand by themselves. Remember, there's the three aspects of the Four Noble Truths. And that's where you get the 12-fold spoke on the Dhamma wheel that you see in a lot of places. So the first noble truth of suffering, what the instruction you're supposed to do for the first noble truth of suffering is, with the thought, this noble truth of suffering, this dukkha has to be understood. That's the thing with the suffering, and that's the crux of the Thai forest tradition, the Theravadin tradition, is to understand suffering. I was saying like last week, in the Mahayana, you have the koan, these kind of puzzles, these kind of things that you try to solve. But in the Theravada Thai forest tradition, there's only one puzzle that we need to solve, that we reflect over and over again. Only one koan in the Theravada, and that is suffering. What is suffering? How do you make suffering? And how do you end it? So in our Theravada, that's what we reflect on over and over every day. What is suffering? What am I suffering over? And how do I stop that? Yeah, so in the beginning, so that's why. And suffering, the Buddha says, the noble truth of suffering, and this suffering, first it has to be understood. And it has to be understood completely. The reason we suffer, and will suffer accordingly to our delusion, our understanding. So the more deluded you are, the more suffering you will have. So as you understand more and more of the world, more and more of suffering around you, there is the correlation to that you will suffer less, naturally. You see where it is you're making suffering for yourself, and naturally the mind will let go. And you will choose a different type of action, different response to the world around you, and suffering happens less. So the first noble truth is there's suffering, then it has to be understood. And then that's one aspect of it. The other one is this suffering has been understood. See, so you have to understand it, and then once you understand it, that you finish with that, the first noble truths. You understood it, and it's completed. And you understood it completely. Okay, so that's why it says, with the thought, this is the noble truth, then next is the noble truth, the cause of dukkha. Okay, so then the second noble truth is the noble truth, the cause of dukkha, and then it's the same. This noble truth of the cause of dukkha, and this cause of dukkha has to be abandoned. So with the first noble truth, the suffering is, you have to understand it completely. Once you understood it, you're free from it. The second noble truth regarding the cause of suffering, what you need to do with that is you have to abandon the cause. Remember, it's always about condition. That's why sometimes religion can be about rites and ritual. You just do this and you get this, and it doesn't really make sense. But Buddhism is always it's very scientific, very empirical. That is, causes, you want to be happy, you have to put the causes for happiness into place, and you'll be happy. You want to be free from suffering, praying to the Buddha is not going to do it. Bowing 1,000 million times in front of the Buddha statue is not going to do that either. You want to end suffering, you have to understand it. That's what the Buddha is saying. And then you have to abandon the cause of suffering. If you have the cause of suffering, which is craving, as long as you crave, you're going to suffer. You want to end suffering, release that craving. That's how suffering stops. It doesn't stop by fixing other people. It doesn't stop by doing really good things all the time. It doesn't stop by running and hiding away. Suffering stops when you abandon the craving. That's how suffering stops. So the second noble truth is the cause of sukha, and this cause of dukkha has to be abandoned. You have to abandon those causes. And then this noble truth of the cause of dukkha, and this cause of dukkha has been abandoned. So once you abandon that, that is the third aspect of the second noble truths. Okay, and going on to the third noble truth. This is a noble truth of the cessation of dukkha. So you want dukkha to end, there's something to be done as well. with the thought, this is a noble truth, the cessation of dukkha, and this cessation of dukkha has to be realized. So this is where the path of training comes into. You have to realize the end of suffering. You don't thinking about it, it's not going to get you where. Realizing meaning you have to set in motion a course of action that brings about the cessation of dukkha. Right? So it's always, like I say, it's always about a training, something to be done. It's not just not enough. But also, part of that training is understanding. But understanding is only the first of the Four Noble Truths. You have to implement and set in motion the second and the third, which is the cessation of dukkha, which has to be realized. And then once it has been realized, that's how dukkha ceases, is when you realize the end of sukha. And then of course the Four Noble Truths is the Eightfold Path, and that's the training. So if you want dukkha to cease, you have to realize it, and then the only way to realize the end of suffering is through the Eightfold Path, which is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. That's the Eightfold Path that we will explore in future talks. But I just want to point out the aspect of the Four Noble Truths. It is a prescription, an outline of things to be done. And understanding is a major portion of it. That's what, so it's not just you get the wisdom from the end. No, so much of it there's the wisdom realized from the beginning. It's understanding. So that's why, as practitioner in the Thai Forest tradition, it's always good to reflect each and every day. What is suffering? How does it express in your life, in real time, here and now? How am I making suffering for myself and others? I remember, I was just thinking this afternoon, we are creatures of comfort. You really think about it. Every movement that you make, physically, even mentally, is to get away from suffering. When you change posture, because your body's aching, that's why you change your posture. When you go to the kitchen, you get home, you go to the fridge, open up, you're looking for something to satisfy you. It is out of suffering that we physically move. And then the mind, if the mind is content, it stays still. When the mind is not content, it goes off and starts thinking about things, finding things to do, to plan, or thinking about things about your holiday that you liked, or thinking about missing the people, bringing up your family or your loved one up, so that way it brings you a nice feeling sensation. All movement of the mind, all movement of the body stems from dissatisfaction, discontent. And the thing is, as you meditate, as the mind becomes more content, you see the expression, the body becomes more tranquil naturally. You move less, you suffer less, you're more at ease. And the mind also becomes more still as you're more happy. You don't move as much. So in the world, and that's why you see, we live in Australia, we have so much on a certain level of physical comfort. But we also live in a society that is very discontent, because it's in the mind. So physically we can all be happy to a certain extent. We have enough to eat. The weather's cold, but we have housing, we have clothing. But yet there's this kind of thirst that we condition to run and to look for things all the time, to make it more comfortable. And it is this very thirst and search that creates so much suffering in our life. We can't sit still long enough. And some people don't see that. They're like, oh, I'm happy, but they're running around doing this, doing that. I'm happy. They don't see, that's part of delusions. You don't see that you're moving around, you're chasing after something, or running away from suffering. Running away from could be just boredom, just nothing to do. Some people have to find something to do all the time. And that is part of the suffering, part of the discontent mind, part of not being peaceful. But most people don't understand that, so they'll continue running around. And running around from one thing to the next, one lifetime to the next. It's the same mind. When you die, they run to the next birth. But as you understand more and more about discontent, dissatisfaction, the antidote to that is obviously to cultivate a sense of peace, a sense of contentment. I encourage people, just say, this is good enough. Yes, the salad's a bit cold, but it's good enough. You have warm gear, good enough for you to sit and watch your breath. Not perfect, but good enough. And once you start to change your relationship to the world by saying it's good enough, instead of trying to make things perfect, just get enough warm gear, have enough warm drinks, just get enough perfect, it's never going to be there. But once you start to change your relation by saying this is good enough, minds become more peaceful, more still, less to do. If it's good enough, you don't have to do it. You don't have to arrange anymore. You can just sit quietly and watch your breath. You don't have to look around to fix things. When it isn't good enough, when it isn't perfect, then you got to fix it. You got to arrange to make it perfect. So I try to tell people, don't be a perfectionist. I hear that a lot sometimes. I'm a perfectionist, Ajahn. Perfectionists are just people who want to suffer. Because you're not going to get perfection in this world, in this dimension, this earthly dimension of ours. The world is not perfect. It's not meant to be that way. Not from the Dhamma perspective. But it's certainly good enough. And good enough becomes really good if you have a peaceful mind. So you start with good enough becomes really good. Oh, it's pretty good. It's not bad. It's good. You can sit and watch your breath and the mind becomes calm, the body becomes light. Oh, this is really great. This is fun. So good enough becomes, not too bad, becomes good, becomes great, becomes wonderful. All starting out with good enough. But if you're looking for perfection, you're going to end up in depression. That's what happens. Because first you find little thing wrong, and that thing goes wrong, and this thing goes wrong. And first, it's terrible. I don't know, something wrong with me. It's not something wrong with the world. It's wrong with me. I'm the one. And then you go, okay, get depressed, leave the monastery, get drunk, and then you make more mistakes, do more foolish things, get a relationship, have kids. That's terrible. That's the worst thing you can do. And it starts to snowball downward then, and that's the end. More life and kids. No. So it starts out with changing a relationship to suffering. This is good enough. Anything in your life, any issue you look, this is good enough. It's one way to change, the formula of instead of suffering to transcend suffering. Another way, and I was always trying to remind people, when you face any difficulty, any challenges, and do not give in to the tendency to say, oh, poor me, I've done something wrong, or poor them, they're really evil, they're making my life difficult because they don't do what I want them to do. Don't blame the world, don't blame yourself. Any difficulty and challenges you face, and you will, that's part of life. Life doesn't go our way, part of impermanent, anicca, unreliable, undependable. That's a reality, right? So anytime you face a challenge and you will, instead of saying, get irritated, get mad, just pull back and remind yourself, it's an opportunity to grow, opportunity to adapt, to learn, to make peace. It's a test. And so don't see it as a failure of the world, a failure on your part, but see it as, this is a test. So I'm going to try to pass it. We're trying to make it work somehow. Find ways to overcome this challenge. Find a way to make peace with it. But maybe it's my first week in the kitchen, the rice didn't turn out well, that's okay. The rest of the 3 dishes turned out okay, so it's not the end of the world. So instead of, focus on one little thing that goes wrong, you focus on the bigger picture, the positive things to take away. So it's always, instead of seeing it as a failure, it's a challenge. It's a lesson. Life's always about learning and adapting and growing from that. Not to hide away, to shrink away. And the skills that you learn in the monastery, in meditation, are the same skills that you need in the world to live a good life, to live a productive life. Skills of making peace, skill of contentment, skill of not making a problem out of things. Those are really basic but important skills that sometimes people miss. They don't teach that in school. They teach all this knowledge, but they don't teach how to become happier, how to work with other people, with differences, how to be more content and happy, how to become peace and harmony with ourselves and others. So, but luckily we have the Buddha, who was very wise, became enlightened, and he gave us an instructions in the forms of the 4 Noble Truths. First Noble Truth, to be understood, understanding, 100%, not 99%, not 80%, 100%. Once you understand suffering, it goes away. And a famous saying by Ajahn Chah, we should put on one of those T-shirts we make one of these years. If there's wisdom, there is no problem. So remember that. If there's wisdom, there's no problem. And the corollary, the reverse of that, is also true. If there's a problem, there's no wisdom somewhere. I'm missing something. I'm not seeing something correctly somewhere. I'm making a problem somewhere. Remind yourself that. If there's wisdom, there's no problem. That is the first Noble Truth. Second Noble Truth, the cause. You have to abandon the cause of suffering. So whatever you're suffering, what is the cause of my suffering? Where is it? Which is craving. Where am I craving? How do I abandon this craving? What craving am I having at the moment? The third Noble Truth, the cessation of suffering only comes about through abandoning that craving. So once you discover what kind of craving you have, you try to abandon that. You have to realize it. You have to realize the cessation of suffering. And only the Eightfold Path is how you put that into effect, to practice. Okay, so that's the 4 Noble Truths and the 3 aspects. And that's where you get the 12 spokes on the Dhammachakka wheel. So I offer that for your reflection tonight.